So, welcome back. We're going to be talking about covalent bonding. Maybe you're in a chemistry or a biology class and you need to understand what covalent bonding is about. And so, right off the bat, I would like to say that covalent bonding involves a sharing of electrons. And so, an example of that would be using these atoms up here that we have to work with. We could have them share electrons and become stable with filled outermost shells of electrons right here. Carbon has 4 valence electrons, and if hydrogen only has 1, then if we draw something like this, what's going to happen is the carbon and all of the hydrogens are going to be stable. The reason why I know they're going to be stable is if you sort of mentally draw a circle around this hydrogen atom, it has effectively 2 valence electrons that count towards its stability. And if you look at carbon over here and mentally draw a circle around this right here and ask yourself, is carbon stable? The answer is yes, because it has 8 valence electrons around it effectively. So check this out. That means these 2 electrons right here, they count for this atom in terms of its stability. They also count for this atom in terms of its stability. So they are shared electrons. And that is how nature gets around this problem of how these atoms are going to interact and not repel each other. They end up sharing electrons for stability reasons and make very strong bonds between them. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Let's go ahead and take a look at how all of this works. Here I just quickly wrote out a definition of covalent bonds, and here I'm showing more of what I had talked about previously with a little more clarity. So freeze this screen if you need to take a look at it, otherwise we're going to move along. And the next question to address that is actually pretty important is which atoms tend to covalently bond together? And the answer is these atoms here, as well as hydrogen as well, tend to covalently bond with each other. So atoms in this block, so to speak. We're talking about from carbon up to the halogens, from carbon up to fluorine's group right here, tend to covalently bond. And if atoms are on opposite sides of the periodic table, like NaCl, then they're going to ionically bond. But we're talking today about things that are going to be covalently bonding, and they're going to be found in here. Okay, and so you can have a single covalent bond here, and that's going to be 2 shared electrons will be represented by a line or a dash. You can also have double covalent bonds, and that would be 4 shared electrons in between atoms. That would be represented by 2 lines or 2 dashes. And there is such a thing as a triple covalent bond that would be represented by 6 shared electrons or 3 lines. You can almost think of these as having 1 line here made up of 2 electrons, 1 line or dash made up of another 2 electrons, 1 line or dash made up of a third pair of electrons here. And so these pairs will form bonds effectively. You can think of it in those terms. I think for me that actually helps when I was learning this. Okay, and at this point it's very important that you understand what representative elements are and what that will tell us. And so these representative elements actually tell us how many valence electrons are in each of these groups or families here. And so it's pretty easy. You just say there's 1 valence electron here for all of these atoms, 2 here, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, with an exception up at the top. For helium, it just has 2 electrons, and that's all it needs to be stable. Okay, so not only does this tell us how many valence electrons are in each atom, it will also suggest to us ionically, if we were looking at this ionically, that these atoms here, these halogens for instance, would want to gain 1 electron to become stable. This group right here would want to gain 2, ionically speaking. This group over here would want to gain 3. And this group over here the next group doesn't tend to ionically bond. So carbon's group doesn't tend to ionically bond. We've also got nitrogen, oxygen, and fluorine's group represented right here. Alright, so that's important information for ionic bonding, but it's also important information here because they can gain electrons through ionic bonding, but effectively they can gain electrons by sharing electrons with their neighbors in covalent bonding. So this group right here, for instance, the halogens, they want to gain 1 electron through ionic bonding, but they could also gain 1 electron through bonding as well. These atoms can typically have 1 bond and then they will become stable. These atoms over here, oxygens, will tend to have 2 covalent bonds to be stable. these will tend to have 1. This group, nitrogen's group right here, will tend to have 3 bonds to be stable. This group over here will tend to have 4 bonds to be stable. Note that carbon doesn't normally ionically bond. It will usually only covalently bond, but we could say that the trend still holds, that this carbon atom will end up having 4 bonds typically to become stable. So that right there, this slide right here is super important for understanding covalent bonds, to help us to recognize how many bonds each of these atoms typically need to be stable. One more concept we need to go over before we can start getting into some problems is this idea of electronegativity. All electronegativity is the ability of an atom to attract an electron to itself. So some atoms are very electronegative, some atoms are not very electronegative. And so the most electronegative atom is fluorine. And then if you go down the periodic table or to the left, or a combination down and to the left, then you end up with less and less electronegative atoms. And so this is a very attractive atom. So what does that mean? Let's say if you have a fluorine atom and you have an electron just floating out in space, and you put, let's say, a carbon atom, and they are the same distance from that free electron right there in space. The question is, where is that electron going to go? It's going to get pulled to one atom or another, and which atom will it get pulled to? Well, in this case, it's going to get pulled more strongly to fluorine. It's much more electronegative than carbon, so it will pull an electron to itself much more strongly than carbon will, and so the electron will end up going to fluorine, which means it's more electronegative. You're going to need to know that term electronegative so that when we go through the rules of covalent bonding, you'll be able to understand what the first rule is. And so let's take a look at this, and we're going to say that we're going to put the least electronegative atom in the center. In this case, the least electronegative atom between carbon and hydrogen is actually a hydrogen. However, the second rule is going to supersede that. So let's go ahead and write in usually. Usually this is going to be true, but if we know what we were talking about in the last slide, hydrogen actually only needs 1 bond to be stable. It only needs to effectively gain 1 electron, you could say. And so also, for looking at how many bonds carbon's going to need to be stable, it's actually going to need 4, right? So it makes more sense to put carbon in the middle and have hydrogens around it, these directions here. And that is exactly what happens in nature. And so we're going to go ahead and simulate that with these Lewis dot structures here. And so if we draw something like that, each of these atoms is now stable. And that's what we're doing also over here. If atoms can only handle 1 bond, such as hydrogen or a halogen, put them at the end or the edge of the molecule. We don't want them to have a central role, since they can only have 1 bond. Alright, so let's go ahead and continue with 3. Step 3 says draw in pairs of electrons or lines to represent single bonds between the atoms. Look at how many bonds each atom typically will need to be stable from the periodic table, and start by putting those in as dots or lines. Alright, so let's take a look at another example. Let's say we have NH3 here. We're going to know from looking at the periodic table that, ionically speaking, nitrogen would need to gain 3 electrons to be stable. In covalent terms, that would mean that nitrogen would need to have 3 covalent bonds to be stable. And since we have 3 hydrogen atoms, it makes the most sense to go ahead and put hydrogen on the outside here. The only thing we need to be aware of is that nitrogen is going to have 5 valence electrons, right? And so we need to draw those in as well, and you would have a stable structure. So this would be correct for NH3 right here. So let's go ahead and continue. In some instances, this won't work. If we have single bonds, we may need something like a double bond, and I'll go through examples of that later. But step 4 says if the central atom has fewer electrons than a full octet, move electrons from edge atoms to form double bonds or even triple bonds with more central atoms. I'm going to do a second screencast based on this material and show examples of what that looks like right after this. There should be a link coming up in a moment for that. Lastly, it says make sure all of the dots for each atom are accounted for in a filled valence shell for all atoms to know you are done. So in other words, if I look and I know that nitrogen is going to have 5 valence electrons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that means I need to draw in all 5 of those. I also need to visually sort of look around this and say, alright, does nitrogen have a filled outermost shell of electrons? And the answer in this case is yes. And the answer for hydrogen atoms is also yes right here, because hydrogen is an exception to the octet rule. It doesn't need to have 8 valence electrons, it only needs 2 to be stable. So thank you for listening. Let's go ahead and take a look at some more examples.